This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include syndicated columnist and author John Hood, political campaign consultant Brad Crone, political campaign consultant Doug Raymond, and Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch. I started to say campaign consultant. We got another great show for you this week. We begin by talking about a new proposal to offer reduced college tuition at our public universities, Justice I. Beverly Lake's reversal of opinion on the death penalty, and a proposal for reduced restrictions for unaffiliated candidates to run for public office. And as always, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Let's get started. Senator Tom Apodaca has introduced legislation to allow students to enroll in our smaller and historically black public universities for $500 per semester. That legislation also would freeze tuition at the other 11 public universities at the rate in which the student first enrolled. Apodaca claims this bill will ensure students don't incur large amounts of debt upon graduation while helping some of our struggling universities. Doug, what do you think of this proposal? How will this impact the students, the universities, and the taxpayers?
Well, that remains to be seen, but it's just fascinating. On the surface, you say, hey, $500 a semester, it's a pretty good deal. And then almost instantly, there's this huge pushback, especially from folks associated with those historically black universities that are saying, hey, you may change the makeup of our university, and I'm not sure we like that. But I go back to something that I think we've talked about at least twice on here. The thing that I like about it, the statistics are staggering at college dropouts who don't pay their own way. And it was interesting, I can't remember who it was, but one of the Democrats in the legislature said, instead of doing this $500 thing, let's just give more financial aid. And that is almost a guarantee that you're not going to get somebody vested. So even if it's $500, if it's their mom or dad or their self paying the $500, I think their chances of success are a lot better. And I like the idea in the other universities of freezing it so you know what your tuition's going to be your freshman year all the way through your senior year.
Brad, there's pushback to that too. The other 11 universities aren't too terribly thrilled with this proposal.
Yeah, they're worried about a revenue cap, and they're worried about making it work out from a finance standpoint. But thinking about it, Tom, it made me look back at when I was at NC State. My tuition was basically $360, $400 a semester when I was working for you at WPTF. And you know, today's tuition, a kid going to East Carolina or NC State University, you're looking at $18,000 a year. So his motives are very plausible on trying to say a lot of parents don't have that type of cash and they end up $60,000, $70,000 in debt the day they graduate.
John, the one question that hasn't been answered in this proposal is who's going to pay for this? Is he's expecting, because just on the $500 tuition, he's predicting it's going to be $60 to $80 million a year. Is he expecting the universities, particularly the historically black universities and smaller universities, to pay for this, or are the taxpayers supposed to pay for it?
My understanding is that he's proposing that taxpayers pick up most or all of the difference. I don't know that I agree with Senator Apodaca's bill. I think the pushback to it, the backlash to it, has been largely unwarranted. They're trying to deal with some very specific and long-standing issues regarding the system as a whole. You've got some university campuses that are bursting at the seams. You've got some that aren't growing as rapidly, or their enrollment is stagnant, or they're concerned about the future of the institutions. Now, if you attract additional students to those campuses, you might change the demographic makeup. But you'll also make sure those campuses are healthier and play a larger role in their respective regional economies. And I think the pushback to that, I can completely understand the historic nature of some of these institutions, but this is the 21st century. They're thinking about how to operate a campus, university campus across all the different regions of the state, and to argue that changing the demographics of the campus would be a no-no is kind of puzzling to me, honestly. This is not the world that those universities are created in, and you're going to have we have a burgeoning Hispanic population. Are we saying that they can attend some universities but not others? We need to calm down and think about the dollars and cents of this proposal, not the symbolism.
Chris, the Chancellor of Fayetteville State University said that he was concerned that cheap tuition might be equated with cheap education. He said, for instance, would you want to buy a $500 car? What do you think of that?
Well, that's one perspective. I think the larger perspective, and what I think is really alarming a lot of people in the university community, is where we make up that $60 and $80 million. This General Assembly has made a discretionary cut every year, several $100 million when you add it up to the university system. This state has made a decision, unfortunately, to keep raising the tuition at all of our schools while we decrease or don't increase funding enough to keep the level up. So I think there is concerns about the demographics at the historically black colleges and universities. By the way, Western Carolina is also involved, which is not an HBCU. But I think the real deal for these small schools is the state of North Carolina going to fund our universities adequately if they take one of our sources of funding away? And the final point is this is something that ought to be decided in a long, thoughtful manner with a study commission with huge participation from the university system, not run in a short session of the General Assembly and run through the Senate.
But this is Lapadaka's last hurrah,
well, that's
as
too
far
bad.
as that goes. One of the things that he's suggesting is that some of these historically black universities consider changing their name. Boy, that's riled a lot of feathers. What do you think of that?
Well, that got pulled out of the bill because it did rile the feathers, and that's not on the table anymore. But whether you like Tom Apodaca's politics or not, one thing he is known for is he's a guy who kind of thinks things out. And, I tend to give it the benefit of the doubt, but I'll go back to what John said. I'm just puzzled. I understand the nature of a historically black university, but it's almost saying, well, if you get too many white people in our university, it's going to change things. In this day and age, I just don't think that's a very valid argument. You're supposed to be preparing these students for going out in the world. They're not going out into historically black jobs or historically black communities. They're going into an integrated world. I don't see the problem with their campuses being a little bit more
Brad, another
integrated.
part of this was to lift, particularly with some of these struggling universities, lift the out-of-state enrollment caps. That's been, 18%, I think.
Correct, especially with like Elizabeth City State University and perhaps Fayetteville State University, and that's been a big issue. It comes back down to dollar and cents, and it comes back down to value. I do not think that historical black universities will win the argument as far as their institutional and historical perspectives, because we do have to move beyond that.
But it's worth pointing out, as Brad was getting at, that out-of-state cap is one of the potential ways that you essentially pay for this, at least for some of the campuses, is that the out-of-state tuition, of course, isn't capped the way the in-state tuition is, and so you're going to get more revenue to presumably cover some of the cost.
Chris, a recent PPP poll showed that this idea is just not popular with the voters of our state at all. How's that going to affect the outcome of Apodaca's legislation?
Well, it's probably not going to affect the outcome of Apodaca's legislation in the Senate. The question will be what happens when it gets to the House, and whether they'll pay attention to public opinion. I think the public is confused about it. I think they are worried a little bit about what the Chancellor of Fayetteville State said. I think they're worried about the historic HBCUs, and I think they're worried about the funding for the university system overall.
Well, we thank you for watching NC Spin on the air or YouTube. Here's a reminder, there's much more on our website, ncspin.com, or NC Spin on Facebook. You'll find video footage not seen anywhere else, perspective pieces from our panel, and my weekly column. Be sure to get more balanced debate from the Old North State on ncspin.com, NC Spin on Facebook, or on Twitter at NC Spin tweets. After these messages, we're going to talk about Lake reversing his opinion on the death penalty.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Baseball players from other countries are considered guest workers here. Baseball, the previous administration and Congress cut a deal in 2006 allowing foreign players to travel freely across the country. Not so for agriculture guest workers. They're vilified for doing work Americans won't, and they face a mountain of red tape just to get here. Shouldn't American agriculture get the same consideration as baseball? Farm Bureau and Agriculture, we keep North Carolina growing.
North Carolina is a great state with great assets.
Among them are 180,000 state employees.
Our legislators are considering important decisions regarding working conditions,
health insurance,
retirement benefits,
and pay for state employees.
Scenic is the one voice at the table when those decisions are being considered.
Scenic is revitalized and refocused.
A stronger Scenic ensures a more effective voice.
Learn more at www.scenic.org.
We now return to NC Spin.
Former Supreme Court Chief Justice I. Beverly Lake has served as a state senator, Superior Court judge, and justice on our Supreme Court. He recently wrote an op-ed piece saying that throughout his career he was a staunch advocate for the death penalty. But recently he's changed his opinion because he says too many innocent men and women are convicted of capital crimes. He further says there's evidence they don't frequently get the adequate representation they deserve, and that too many with intellectual disabilities, mental illness, and other impairments are more likely to be wrongfully convicted. John, you traditionally have been an advocate for the death penalty. Did Justice Lake make a sufficient case for you to change your mind?
I think Justice Lake made a sufficient case for public attention and for additional reforms of the judicial process. I'm still not persuaded about the fundamental question of the death penalty. In my opinion, there are just some crimes, some heinous crimes for which life imprisonment is not a just sentence. It's not appropriate to the crime. There aren't that many, but there are some, and I do think capital punishment is the only appropriate just sentence. That having been said, Justice Lake brings up a number of very important questions having to do with representation, having to do with police work, having to do with the length of the appeals process and the way the appeals process works, and we certainly do have to work on all of those things.
Well, one of the things that he brought up in this op-ed piece, Chris, was the fact that he didn't think we should continue to allow juries to make the decision about the death penalty. Mm-hmm. You agree with that?
Well, I agree we need to do away with the death penalty. I mean, I think there's so many flaws. That's an interesting, it's an interesting take on it. It's, it's worth remembering there are very few industrialized countries in the world that have the death penalty anymore. We're in a small minority. I think Justice Lake, I give him all the credit in the world for coming to this position after starting the Innocence Commission, after being personally involved in watching these cases. And if there's one thing that ought to make you think twice, it's the case of Henry McCullum, who we talked about on this show many months ago, who literally was so mentally handicapped. The prosecutor at the time said, just sign this confession. And he said, if I sign this, can I go home? And he said, yeah, of course you can, Henry. And he signed a confession saying he did something. He spent 30 years of his life in prison for something he didn't do. That is not as rare as you think. And I think that's the message of Justice Lake, which is the system is fundamentally flawed. It's run by humans, and you can't correct a mistake when you execute somebody.
And Brad, to that point, he talked about the fact that there were too many people with intellectual disabilities, mental illness, and other impairments that are too often wrongfully convicted. So the question is, what can we do to ensure that this does not occur?
Well, make sure that our police services have the adequate training, adequate resources, that the district attorney's staff has adequate resources, as well as making sure the defense attorneys who are defending these defendants, these people who have been accused of these crimes, that they get the adequate resources they need to have a fair trial. I have long been an advocate for the death penalty. I said 2 years ago I was very concerned about some of the cases that the News and Observer had done, and I've changed my opinion. But mine's more of a fiscal standpoint of saying that we just flat can't afford it. It costs too much. It's easier to do life without parole, putting them in, incarcerating them and throwing away the key, than it is to going through the death process.
Brad talked about this business about the legal representation. What so many times happens is these get court-appointed attorneys. They don't pay them a heck of a lot, so they don't get the best and the brightest court-appointed attorneys. Is that something we should be looking at changing, Doug?
Well, I wouldn't want to say a lot of those court-appointed attorneys are new, and they do that for a few years, and they go on to be excellent attorneys, so they do the best job they can. I think, I agree with a lot of what John said. Everybody at the table really, I mean, over the years, I've kind of taken a different look at the death penalty, but the one thing that really troubles me is what our prison system. There's another step in this. It's not just the judicial, it's the prison system. And when you put somebody convicted in murder in there, and they're in there with people that are nonviolent offenders and mostly in there for drug offenses, and they basically have to become murderers to survive. We need not only judicial reform in this state, we need some prison reform in this state. I just watched something the other night where wardens were admitting that they understand that drugs coming in and out of the prison, and they kind of in some ways turn a blind eye to it because it keeps the prisoners calm. The gang situation, well, they police themselves. we are very archaic in the way our prison systems, if we're supposed to be a civilized nation, our prisons aren't run very civilized.
Man, after that, I got to take a break. After these messages, we're going to come back and have some more on NC Spin, talking about relaxing ballot access.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Closed, a sign you're seeing too often, especially on abandoned grocery stores and markets. When these stores close, we all lose. We lose the healthy North Carolina grown fresh produce, and our farmers lose local outlets to sell what they grow. The Healthy Corner Store Initiative can change this by providing resources to local small store owners so they can stock and sell fresh fruits and vegetables. Find out how you can get involved at ncallianceforhealth.org.
You only get one pair of eyes. Keeping them healthy is critical to your quality of life. Members of the NC Optometric Society know this. These highly skilled doctors have the latest technology and the medical training to care for your eyes and the eyes of those you love. Make sure you visit your optometrist for an eye exam on a regular basis. For more information on keeping your eyes healthy or to find the right optometrist for you, visit nceyes.org. Remember, healthy eyes, healthier lives.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
North Carolina has some of the most stringent laws in the nation for allowing independent and unaffiliated voters to gain access to the election ballot. Current law says that an unaffiliated voter must get signature petitions from 2% of the voters in statewide, that's unaffiliated candidates, by the way, must get 2% of the registered voters in a petition on statewide elections, or 4% from those in a legislative district election. Representative Ken Goodman, who's a Democrat, plans to introduce legislation to grant unaffiliated voters easier access to the ballot. Brad, I know, in disclosure, you are working with him on this, but with 28% of our voters registered as unaffiliated, what's preventing our state from making it easier to run as an unaffiliated candidate?
Well, we have an artificial barrier, Tom, that basically forces unaffiliated people to go out and knock on registered voters' doors to get petitions to go, and it's just one more hurdle. There's been a lot of talk of having a legal challenge to the law under the equal protection provision, because Democrats can just go down to the Board of Elections, or if you're a registered Republican, you can go down to the Board of Elections. Ken is putting this out here to begin the discussion this year. We'll introduce it in January of next year. And basically with the premise is that if you're registered unaffiliated and you want to go run, you can go run. If a second unaffiliated files for the office, you have a primary just like you would for a Democrat or for a Republican, and you could have 3 people on the ballot going into the November election.
At the heart of all of this, Doug, is it the 2 political parties that have prevented this from happening in the past? Because this topic's been discussed before about loosening the restrictions on ballot access.
Sure. I mean, it doesn't benefit them, and they don't want it to happen. But I'm going to tell you, I've seen been involved in some cases where there was quality unaffiliated candidates. They went and got the signatures in plenty of time, ran traditional campaigns, and you think in this atmosphere with the unaffiliated growing so much, there still is, despite what a lot of people think, a lot of party loyalty. So I think even if you did grant the ballot access, I think you'd be surprised that it's still a 2-party state.
One of the things that we've heard as a reason for not loosening the restrictions on ballot access is we don't want to lengthen the election ballots any more than they already are by having dozens of names of candidates on it. But in this age of electronic voting machines, John, what is the opposition to having more choices on the ballot?
Well, more choices is not the same thing as having 15 or 20. I think that the argument made that you just described is an argument against getting rid of restrictions altogether and just having people list with 5 voters. You still need to be able to get some number of signatures. It's just that North Carolina has standards that are so high. I mean, lots of other states have lower thresholds for third parties, lower thresholds for unaffiliated voters, and they seem to get along without 15 or 20 candidates. I think we'll survive it. But I do agree a little bit here with Doug that we shouldn't oversell what this is about. Remember, the municipal election cycle is largely made up of nonpartisan races. Not all, because there are some partisan cities, but not very many. And it's very low turnout. So let's be careful what we're expecting.
Well, I don't think he's projecting necessarily that it'll improve voter turnout.
Party labels attract attention.
The other thing is that I think it's an interesting premise that we say, okay, if we open it up to unaffiliated, we'd have 15 unaffiliateds. Why would unaffiliateds be more likely to file in mass numbers as in Republicans or Democrats? Well, you'd have to have a primary.
You've got to have a primary. But here's what's going on demographically across our state is that there are 7 counties now where independents have plurality. And there are 50 counties in the state where independents outnumber either one of the parties, traditional parties. So it is an issue we're going to have to deal with. It may be now, it may be January, it may be 2 years from now, 4 years from now, but the unaffiliated voters are a cast of vote that we're going to have to deal with.
Well, let's talk about this for a second, Chris. Why are people registering on do they just not like the political parties?
Well, I think that some people don't like the political parties. Some people want to be independent in thinking. I think there's 2 things about this. One is I completely agree we have two restrictive campaign access laws, and we should work on that, and we should not be one of the most restrictive in the country. We need more people to run. But I think it's important, as many of us have said on this show before, just because you're unaffiliated doesn't mean you have the same philosophy as other people who are unaffiliated. A lot of unaffiliated people are very liberal. A lot of unaffiliated people are very conservative. Most of the time they vote for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party in a given election. So the question would be, who are those unaffiliated people? And if you had a candidate, who would run as an unaffiliated person? Because you'd have half the unaffiliated people saying he's too conservative and half saying he's too liberal. So I think it would be fascinating.
And listen, what Chris is saying is true. Some of them just want to be independent. But the way our ballots are set up in North Carolina, where your primary, you can choose the ballot you want, unless you had a strong reason to be Democrat or Republican, why wouldn't you register unaffiliated? Because you can always go where the action is.
All right, before we close this segment out, and we're running out of time, in 2 days we're going to be going to the polls in the June 7th primary elections for Congress and for Supreme Court Justice. I'd like to ask my 2 political consultants, what's going to be on the minds of the voters as they're casting these votes?
Getting the kids to soccer practice and worrying about the weekend coming up.
So it's not issues.
That's not on their mind. 5% turnout's what I'm calling for, really low.
Yeah, 5 or 6, and I think this is it's unheard of what's happening here. One person's name is going to be on their mind. It's going to be a very personal decision that they're going to go and take their time to go through that process to get that ballot to vote for one person. So I don't think, yes, there may be issues that made them choose that one person, but it's not going to be an issue. It's going to be people-oriented, and a lot of that's going to be the get out the vote effort and what candidate motivated them to take that time to go out and do it.
All right. After these messages, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
It's a fact, patients who receive care in the medical home from a trusted family physician reduce healthcare costs through prevention, early detection, and affordable management of high-cost chronic diseases.
Every dollar invested in healthcare matters. Let's invest them wisely, building on North Carolina's medical home model. Better health begins with a medical home, a trusted family physician, the best return on our healthcare investment. Learn about the importance of medical homes at ournchealthcare.com.
Closed, a sign you're seeing too often, especially on abandoned grocery stores and markets. When these stores close, we all lose. We lose the healthy North Carolina grown fresh produce, and our farmers lose local outlets to sell what they grow. The Healthy Corner Store Initiative can change this by providing resources to local small store owners so they can stock and sell fresh fruits and vegetables. Find out how you can get involved at ncallianceforhealth.org.
We now return to NC Spin.
All right, this is always one of our favorite parts of the show when we ask the panelists to tell us something we don't know. Chris Fitzsimon, I'll start with you.
Well, here's a sleeper issue for the gubernatorial campaign, the Governor McCrory's use of the North Carolina state airplane to fly home from Raleigh frequently. A story, I guess about 10 days ago, from Nick Oshner of WBTV in Charlotte showed that the governor was sometimes the only person on the plane other than the pilot and security flying home back and forth. I think you're going to hear a lot about this, especially as big an issue as it was with former Governor Easley taking the helicopter home to Southport. It's not that long a drive to Charlotte when you're in the back of a nice highway patrol car. I think this will be an interesting issue in the fall.
All right. Doug, tell us something we don't know.
We just talked about the primary elections. Brad said probably 5%. I think it'll be about 6%. I'm going to tell you, candidates are different. Some candidates kind of run the show and the consultants adjust to them. Some candidates say, you're my consultant, tell me what to do. But I'm going to tell you, there's going to be some surprises for people who have not adjusted their game plan to a very, very unique set of circumstances. This is all about voter turnout, and you know exactly which people are coming out. And if you haven't reached out to them and made a personal contact with them, shame on you, and it's on your head. But I think it's going to be some surprises. And I just got a funny feeling. We were talking about this during the break. Watch maybe for a surprise out of District 9.
Interesting. So television won't do it, personal contact with it.
I think it's personal contact.
Interesting. Brad, tell us something we don't know.
I'm just chuckling over here. I had something else I was going to discuss, but I've got to follow up on what Chris said about the state helicopter and the state plane. You know, the gray hairs do pay off. Remember 1982 when DM locked Faircloth and Clinton was the Commerce Secretary for Governor Hunt and got dinged pretty heavy for using the state helicopter to fly from Raleigh to Clinton. And then Governor Hunt, of course, in the '84 campaign had the same problem. So governors and Commerce Secretaries always get in trouble with state planes.
Interesting. John, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, we've heard a lot about how North Carolina is an urbanizing state, and that is true to some extent, but we have to keep it in perspective. North Carolina is the largest state. Among the large states in the country, North Carolina is by far the most rural. And when you look at growth, urbanization in North Carolina is still, it's like we have one of the lowest density sets of cities in the country. So what's really happening in North Carolina is not urbanization, it's suburbanization. There's a big difference.
Interesting. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State, including what happened in the elections. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.